Thank you to all of our panelists and for everyone for joining today. Looking forward to a really good conversation around Slack and education, and really trying to facilitate a conversation around how people are using Slack for their educational purposes and what questions people might have in the group. So the format will be roughly, we'll have 5 or 7 minutes, that range of presentation from each of our panelists, followed by a quick Q&A at the end of each for clarification or follow-up, and then a larger Q&A at the end of the session. And again, if you've got any questions, you can type those in the chat. To start off today, we've got Stefan Helmreich. Stefan's going to talk to us about his experience using Slack in his anthropology course. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Aaron, and it's good to see everybody. Hi, Reese. We've been emailing about OCW sites today, so it's nonstop education. I don't know why I was asked to do this, but I do use Slack. I don't think that I have like anything totally original. I can tell you what I'm doing, and maybe that's useful. The presentation will therefore be like 2 minutes, but I use Slack in my anthropology classrooms. So we're thinking about kind of a 40 to 50 person classroom. And I ask students to post comments on our readings prior to coming to class. And I organize the Slack channel into, little channels that correspond to the sessions. And so prior to each thing, people are asked to meditate on, what the readings are. Maybe I have some structured questions that I want them to answer. And that does a couple of things. It makes people come to class like super prepared, actually more prepared than I'm used to them being, which is quite nice. So they've already given things some thought, and I'm able to go through those comments and get a sense of what people understood, what they may not have understood, what kinds of claims they find interesting or alarming or disturbing or reassuring. And so I make a deadline that things should be submitted by like about 3 hours before class. So there's time for everyone to kind of take a peek, including, importantly, me. And I use those Slack comments to do a couple of things, not only to evaluate what they're getting out of the reading, but if I have the time, which is not always, I will go through my lecture notes for the day, and I will put call outs to things that people said in the Slack, on my notes itself, so they feel like when I'm doing a lecture that they're included. And that's a good, I think it's a good way to kind of activate that kind of inclusion. And I can then also call on people to kind of say, to do the live version of their premeditated thought, right? Which kind of lowers the bar for speaking in important ways, I think, particularly for folks who are maybe shy or nervous, don't necessarily always know what to say. Now they have something to say. So I think that's the general kind of thing that I do. One thing that I did pretty early on, which worked kind of nicely, was, I really am wishy-washy about my policy of whether electronics are allowed in the classroom. I kind of like forgot to say, don't bring your laptops, pay attention to me. Or, on the other hand, it's okay, you can do some shopping. But since people do often have their electronics available, what I've done sometimes is ask them to open the Slack page and pick out a comment from another student and read it, and offer some thoughts about what that other student had to say. And particularly at the beginning of the term, that was super useful for also just getting the students to know each other, right? So, oh, Kaylee says this, where's Kaylee? And the person will raise their hand, and we're all masked, so, So it's a good way to kind of break the ice and make people do some crosstalk. And I make it pretty clear that you are to find a comment in the Slack that you find interesting or that appeals to you, that you want to kind of surface. So I make it hard to say, I'm not saying like, find something that you think you disagree with. So there's none of that, right? It's not smack, it's Slack, right? So it's this thing to kind of generate a kind of conviviality. And so I found it actually super useful, both prior to class and in the class itself. And that concludes my presentation.
That was Awesome. So thank you for sharing your story of using Slack in education. It looks like Cheryl might have a question.
I just want to say getting students more prepared than you ever expected is no small accomplishment. That is a holy grail of sorts. So I'm going to give a second reaction.
I actually wrote that down and put little stars next to it. So yes, I agree that is quite that's amazing.
I actually have a question, just real quickly. Yeah, so I was just curious that when students are posting comments about the readings, before they get to class, have you seen them interact with each other's comments, or do they sort of save that for in class? Like, as you said, you have them pull up a post and read it in class. Do you see them interacting like before that with each other in Slack?
Yes, thank you very much for that reminder. That indeed does happen, and that's great, right? People will say, I really like what X, Y, and Z person 3 steps ahead of me said about this, and I want to amplify that, or people actually have done some disagreeing in super generative and productive way, and very nice. Like, I would like to disagree with this because I see it somewhat differently. Yeah, nobody's misbehaved, but yes, they do respond to each other, and that's also a good feature.
Great, thank you.
I actually had 2 questions.
Go for it. Yeah.
So I just wanted to circle back to, you're basically organizing these threads of conversations with the students based on readings. And so I'm in my head in Slack thinking, wait a second. So you have a channel dedicated to your class, and every lecture 1 pre-reading is the start of a thread. And within that, everyone's replying to that thread. Am I understanding that correctly?
You're understanding it absolutely correctly. Yes.
Awesome. I was like, oh, how? Okay. And then I guess what I'm really curious about is this incentivized, and are there points attached to students, responding on Slack? Because I'm just really curious how you're making sure everyone's really contributing, doing their part. And if you are taking points, how are you gathering that data?
Oh yeah. Thank you for that. I totally forgot about that part. Yes. It is toward their participation grade. So yeah, being the person who operates the power levers, I was invisible to myself there for a moment. Yes, it's part of their kind of participation grade, and they're permitted to miss 3 of them over the term. Yeah, so I guess So if they don't speak the entire session, that's okay, because they've already spoken in Slack, right? But yes, I do make it part of the participation. But I'm being super lenient about it right now because there is still a pandemic. And I think people are many of my students are very fragile. So, don't tell them. No, you can tell them, but like if they miss 4, it's like, I don't yeah. So
no, I just following up on this quick exchange, I think one of the things that I think is really important to highlight here is how you're utilizing this to build the community into the class, right? Like I was struck by that, like this is a way to build the community, as you mentioned, to sort of get to know one another, to become aware of people's ideas and their sharing and those pieces. I think as you start to build that community, it naturally can grow in some ways that sort of you see not having to quote unquote police it as much, right, because it is just part of the ingrained part of the course. And that struck me as part of the nature of the way you've sort of made this happen in the class. So thanks for sharing that. And I look forward to coming back to some of those. Yeah. I do want to circle on to our next panel presenter and give the floor to Monika Avello, who will talk a little bit about her use of Slack for more on the course team side in TAs and sort of helping communicate with them. So go ahead, Monika.
Hello, so I'm Monika, or Moni. And so a little background on who I am and why I'm managing course teams on Slack. I am the 701 Introductory Biology GIR course coordinator or instructor, depending on who you ask, which means I do lots of things, including communicating and creating designs, designing PSATs and exams, and helping coordinate our TA teams, which depending on the class, can range from a class about 70 to, let's say on the higher end, 440 students. And so that means I could, yes, so I could be working with anywhere from 4 TAs to 17 TAs, and the communication need increases exponentially, especially past 10 people. And so something that I have started doing, and I think to great success, is to basically make mandatory that our TAs join a private channel that is dedicated to our course team in order for myself and them to communicate very, very quickly. And this has been really great for a couple of things, but I've distilled it to really sort of five things. So anything you do on Slack, you can technically do on email. Like it's not groundbreaking. What I will say though is the benefit and the fun of Slack that sort of trumps the email experience is that it's a much faster turnaround and a lot lower of a barrier to reach out to someone. When you like write someone an email, you feel like it needs to at least be a paragraph. Whereas I'm very comfortable just like pinging my TAs with like an emoji or just like a, hey, what's going on? Like, are you going to be able to do grading? And they can react to me, or they could say, oh, sorry, I forgot, or oh, please remind me of things. And so it just, there's much faster turnaround. And I actually asked some of my TAs, and something that's also very nice is Slack just feels a little less formal. And that can actually really reduce sort of the activation energy to communicate, because no one's like if I'm like replying to my TAs with a smiley face, they're like, oh, there's a friendly human, and like, this is fine. I'll ask a small question because it doesn't hurt me. And so I think that's been very nice, particularly for undergrad TAs who might sometimes be intimidated suddenly reaching out to professors and instructors and graduate TAs. Now, something also very nice is, as I think Stefan nicely pointed out, you can organize in your channel all these different threads. And so you can start a thread in order to say, hey, any partial credit for this PSET, comment here. And that's really quite easy to do. And you can have a lot of discussion. Again, that just feels more accessible, like communicating with 17 people total. It just feels easier to post it on a Slack channel rather than reply all on an email thread. And something that's actually been a very nice use of this is when our TAs are grading assignments, we often have dedicated groups of TAs who are responsible for sort of making decisions on partial credit. And so we'll have conversations amongst the TAs as they're grading on, hey, PSET, whatever TAs, what should we do about this sort of partial credit answer? What do you think? And everybody has an opportunity to weigh in, and you can sort of refer back to it. And it's just, it's really great for big group communication. The other two things that are quite nice is, for those of you who are unaware, you can schedule messages on Slack, which is a godsend, because I always remember things always at like 11:35 at night. I'm just like, why? And so it's really, really handy and helpful for your teaching team when they receive sort of regularly scheduled reminders about deadlines, or please remember to review this assessment, or don't forget we are releasing grades to students at this time. And all of that can be scheduled. So you can just have that ready to go and then set it and forget it, and it all magically happens for you. So from a coordinating perspective, it's really, really fabulous. And I highly recommend it. The other very fun thing is, you can't really update an email message, but you can update Slack messages. And so it's actually quite fun when you ask your teaching team to maybe vote on a time, or, choose a topic, that you can actually update your message as people start to react or to say things and say, oh, 8 people have responded to the survey. Awesome. Remaining 4 to go. And when everybody responds, you can update your message and be like 100% completion. Congratulations. And everybody can like have little dancey emojis and is very excited. And so there's this sense of real time and accountability that can be sort of infused into Slack messaging with a course team that just makes it just very engaging. It's just kind of fun to see the emojis people use, or sort of the ways that people will react. And the last thing I'll say is we're often using a lot of different digital tools. So I have a lot of Google Drive documents and links, and our staff meeting notes are a shared Google Doc, and all of these can be shared. And it's very nice to have sort of a central space for communication and then a central space for files, and having them be able to communicate between each other has been very, very helpful. And so the feedback I've gotten pretty universally since I've implemented this across different 701 course teams is they're always like, this is really amazing. This is really helpful. The reminders are great. It's so nice. I feel like I know people and I can reach out whenever I have a question. The team feels accessible. And so it's felt like a great success. And I'm excited to think about Slack now for the students. But I'm definitely a fan of Slack for the course team. So that's me.
That's awesome, Monica. Thank you. That was, it sounds awesome. I want to come and share dance emojis in the Slack channel. That sounds
great.
Awesome.
There are many kinds. The more rainbow, the better. They're very happy.
Yes, right, exactly. For those that don't know, there's the dancing Tim the Parrot, or yeah, the Beaver, Tim the Beaver. Yeah, there's all sorts of ones. Any questions from folks who are joining us?
I have a question. I'm sitting here remembering all my favorite emojis, so thank you so much, Monica, for bringing that to my attention. I was wondering, though, if it sounds like it's very effective for you to communicate with your TA team. Do you get up things coming? Do they, communicate to you? Is it something that they actually in turn use?
Yes, absolutely. Like I'll have, we also use this for, across the TA team. You might have a TA who suddenly says, oh, I've gotten ill, I need someone to cover my recitation, or someone says, oh, I had a question in an office hour and I think there's an error on the P set. And so I definitely, it's a two-way street. I use it from my perspective as a way to really like keep in touch and keep ourselves coordinated, but the TAs are definitely also speaking up and are capable of sharing their opinions and or questions, like with the entire team and with myself.
Great, thanks.
So that's actually something I wanted to follow up before we go to Leo's question in the chat. Are they building a community amongst themselves as well? So is it really just communication between you and them, or have they sort of started to take ownership of it themselves and answer one another rather than you having to maybe be the voice of answering everything all the time, as may be the case in an email thread, for example?
Yeah, so I've definitely I'm thinking of a favorite interaction from last semester where we had a small TA team, so they were very close, and we had maybe one professor also in our Slack channel, and this class covered topics that were not very common for everybody to know about, ecology. And so we often had these really great discussions with the TAs initiating, saying like, how do we demonstrate, how do we calculate how these two species are more evolutionarily closely related than the other? And there would be this long exchange, like at 6 p.m. at night, where the TAs are going back and forth going, I thought about it this way. And they're like, oh, I thought about it this way. And then the professor at the end would chime in and be like, that is correct. And we would all, be very excited. I kind of lost my thread, but basically I've definitely seen this kind of exchange without me. And that's also happened around even with partial credit, that sometimes I'll be out of commission for the afternoon and I'll definitely come back and see that my TAs have been chatting with each other about like, no, I'm pretty sure that doesn't count as full credit. They kind of missed this key point. Here's what I would recommend. And the TA says, oh, thank you. And I was not involved.
Very good. I do want to thank you for that. And I think it sounds like that is, it's building this own sort of learning community of TAs and instructors, which I think is great. The question in the chat was, how do you manage to get students to adopt it once and for all? Like, how do you get that to be the platform of choice versus still maybe receiving emails or other messaging, or, how do you convince everybody that this is the place that this happens?
Yeah, so one of the things we do in the biology department specifically is we have instructor TA agreements. And it is very formal that I say we are going to communicate through Slack. And then very early on, even before the semester starts, I hound every single human, invite them to the MIT biology workspace, and then confirm that they are in fact receiving and able to respond to my messages. And that is the only way that I will that they can expect to communicate with me. And I haven't had anyone fight me. They really are at a disadvantage if they're not on the Slack channel. And most folks find it so helpful and I'm also very aggressive about hounding people if they're not on it, that I've not had anybody sort of not adopt Slack. but I think it helps to be very official about it. And I do have to sometimes, like, IS&T has to get involved in order to make sure they can actually sign on. So there is an initial push, but once they're on, and then they find it really helpful.
Awesome, thank you. And hopefully that answers the question. Michelle Tomasic wrote in the chat, this is something that they're seeing in 801 and 802 with their grad TAs as well. And it makes everybody want to sort of do a better job. And I think that's right. That's the idea, right? Is if you can start to build this community of practitioners, of educators that are working with you, that goes a long way to sort of helping normalize and get better work out of your TAs and more effective instruction across the board. That's awesome. So I want to be cognizant of time and move on to our final instructor panelist for today, and then we'll circle on to one more. So next up is Tristan Collins. So Tristan is coming to us from the mathematics department. The floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. So I should preface this with the fact that I used Slack during the, spring semester of 2020. Is that right? Or maybe it was fall semester of 2020. So everything was online. So Slack was used not so much as a choice, but as a necessity. So I used it in a class with 400 students, which is not really what Slack is designed for 400 people. But the idea was to have a place which could function sort of like the classroom. So a place where students could talk to each other, they could interact with TAs, they could interact with me, and a place where I could sort of funnel a lot of the course stuff through. So for example, office hours were sort of started through Slack. So people could post their Zoom links in Slack. You could have question and answer sessions. Students could work together on problem sets and this kind of thing. So it was really as an attempt to try to create some version of the stuff that we are used to in a regular classroom. So let me just show you. I actually still have my Slack channel, so I can show you what it looked like, how it was organized. So when you have 400 students, the organization becomes kind of important. So this is it's now been broken down, but you can see it a little bit. So there was, you can see here, there's a recitations panel. So before there was a Slack chat for each different recitation. So recitations are like small groups. Only students from each recitation were able to access those Slack channels as well as their TA. There were study rooms, which took a little bit of trial and error, but originally they were intended to just be places where students could interact with each other, but then it became clear that it was more efficient in some way to organize them into, so each room was dedicated to a problem on each problem set. So if each problem set had 7 problems, there was a problem study room for problem 1, a study room for problem 2, et cetera, where students could go and ask questions, answer other people's questions, talk to the TAs about specific questions. There was an announcements panel, which was just for me to broadcast announcements about the course, about exams or homework assignments. Well, there were no exams, but homework assignments, due dates, that kind of stuff. And a main hall, which was just for sort of general chat. So main hall was accessible to everyone. So were the study rooms. Announcements was just staff only. And then there was also a staff channel, which I've now deleted, but that was just used for coordinating between me and the TAs to discuss things like grading, sort of what Monika was talking about. So very similar. And it was actually, so I would say it was quite popular. I think a lot of students liked it. Not everybody. I didn't make it mandatory to use it. That kind of thing is hard to implement with 400 students. But it was quite popular. People used it. I think the people who did use it got a lot more out of the class than the people who didn't. It was great because it sort of, it makes it, it really lowers the barrier for students to approach me or the other TAs in the class with questions, and it also made it possible for them to talk to each other, you know, in a digital education, you know, when everything's online. I think that's the thing that students miss the most. And certainly there were a lot of students who, you know, some students in the class who really did the work of a TA, but maybe from a less imposing point of view. So they really helped their classmates, and there were some really great, I think, very productive discussions on there. And it was a bit, you know, there was also some social aspects, students getting to talk to each other. And if you remember, that was the fall 2020 was also the presidential election. So there was a lot of emotional support happening within the 1803 Slack channel. So, so all in all, I would say it was a big success. The only slight complication is that Slack competes a bit with Piazza when it comes to education stuff. And I think that was a little bit hard to explain to students. We use both. I think Piazza is very good for very formal, sort of well-posed questions, and less good for discussion. I didn't really have a rigid policy about where one should be used versus the other, but I think there were some students who felt like there was some common overlap between the two. I don't think either one replaces the other, but definitely that was a little bit of that was maybe the part that was most difficult to convince students, was that they should be using both and not just one or the other. Yeah, so anyways, I'll end my presentation there.
That was great. Thank you, Tristan. I'll give a minute for folks that want to ask some questions maybe of Tristan, and before we move on to our final panelist.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
So Tristan, when you had the Slack channel for your students, was this through the Canvas integration for Slack? Like it was through the LMS, because I can't imagine you having to invite 400 students.
Oh no, yeah, I had to invite 400 students individually. Yeah.
Oh.
It was one pretty painful day, or afternoon. I think the most painful part was that they all had to be invited to their own recitation channels as well. So it wasn't like I was inviting everyone to one Slack channel. But yeah, it took me a while to do that. And then of course, as at the beginning of the term, when there's people dropping the course or joining the course, then you have to also, I mean, it's sort of continual, but I would say once the bulk of the 400 people was done, it was not such a big deal to maintain as the semester went on. But yeah, that was, unfortunately, Slack does not have a great way to add 400 students or 400 people to a Slack channel all at once.
So one of the upsides, this may have been before the full integration was in place, but now one of the upsides is that through the Slack integration with Canvas, we can actually pair people directly in. So from your roster in Canvas, we can populate a single channel with all of the folks that are on your roster in Canvas.
Oh, that's amazing.
Into one thing.
That would have saved a full day.
Yeah. So hopefully that encourages continual use down the line, and that it lowers that barrier, and you can activate that integration, and it will sync those students into that channel. So good news on that front.
Yeah. I think I did have some conversations with people at Slack about how I should do this, and they said, best of luck to you. So maybe they went ahead and fixed that issue.
Yeah, we think we've got that one squared away with the Canvas and LTI. So some folks have actually used that this term to some success, I think. Other questions? So we'll circle back and continue the conversation in a moment, but I want to turn to our final panelist, the learning engineer actually on Open Learning Residential's team, Lauren Totino, has been sort of checking out all sorts of different uses of Slack and how people have been using it broadly, and want to share a few points with the group about what she's sort of discovered along the way, and hopefully facilitate even some more conversations about uses. So Lauren, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Aaron, and thank you to our three great panelists for sharing your experiences with Slack. And so what I'm going to do is share a few more potential use cases for how you can use Slack for teaching and learning. And you'll actually see some of them, Tristan just touched on actually as well, and some of them might be new and different from the examples we heard today. But these are just a few ways that from seeing how others are using Slack at MIT, just a few that I brought up here. One is for student group work or group projects that are maybe are longer term and last for a longer chunk of the semester. And some of the Slack features that really help with this are having private channels for each group, kind of like having a channel for each recitation section. The file sharing, which Monika touched on, is also really helpful for groups who are constantly sharing or working on the same documents. And even just the nature of threaded discussions and how that's a big feature of Slack. That's great for tracking progress over time. Like I said, especially if it's like a longer term kind of thing. Recitation sections, Tristan had touched on that one already, again with using the private channels feature, and something like channel search too is really helpful in a case where students are asking a lot of questions, because you can maybe search for some keywords and see if your question's already been asked before and sort of look back and see if you can get even more answers. I've also seen it used in a more informal way for like informal conversation, that community building aspect that Aaron's talked about before, and just other ways to sort of apply content that you're working with in your course. So again, using public channels and the threaded nature of discussions in Slack. For example, you could have a channel that's dedicated to like talking about news or current events and the ways that those articles relate to course content, or just a space for students to talk about other ways that the course content is applying to their lives. Alternative or supplement to office hours. I think Tristan also touched briefly on the idea of posting office hours information. That's something that like a TA can monitor, for example, and use it to do everything from posting logistical information, like when and where in-person office hours is happening. But a channel could also be used to have a dedicated time period where the TA is answering questions from students, just so they don't have to wait for, the one or two times that there's an in-person office hours session. And then lastly, I think a lot of people use Slack for this, just course communications and announcements. A lot of people just use the default general channel that's automatically part of your Slack workspace when it's set up. But the big thing here, and again, Monika touched on the idea of like norm setting and really encouraging everyone to like stick to a communication method. I think if you wanted students and or your course team to really use Slack for contacting people or asking questions, things like that, you just have to set that norm that, hey, everyone, we're going to use Slack instead of email or instead of Canvas announcements. Or if you're using more than one, like, again, just make sure you're establishing that at the beginning of the course. And yeah, these are just a few ways we've seen Slack being used at MIT. And of course, this is on top of the great examples we heard from our panelists. So feel free to ask any questions if you have any. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And so there's a couple of things that I've written down in terms of questions that I wanted to ask the panelists before we jump in. And one of them is something we haven't touched on yet, but the question is like, what do you do at the end of the term? So, when, in Monika's case, as there can be some really rich and great materials that are sort of historical documents of like, oh yeah, we don't want to do that again, or maybe we always want to make sure that problem set one is dealing with this thing. How do you deal with that? Is it just adding the new TAs to the old channel so that it's still searchable? And on the other side, Tristan, I'm curious, like, what might that look like if you were to try to reuse this again with a course? Would it just be repopulating a new course with new materials? I'm just curious how people have thought about this or worked through some of those ideas.
Well, maybe I can start, as I showed you my deleted Slack channel. So I tried to pass it along to the person who was teaching the same course in the spring semester of 2021. Which they didn't end up using it, but I thought, because there's so much student content on there, I didn't feel comfortable leaving that there for posterity or whatever. So I ended up just deleting all the messages and removing everyone from the channel. But I think, yeah, that's just one of those things that I wasn't sure how to navigate that in a way that assured everybody's privacy in a way that I felt comfortable with. So.
Yeah, I guess just to jump on that, I'm about to go into my second year of instructing. And so I'm about to reach this point where I ask, do I revive the old spring 2020 channel for spring 2021? And I think my instinct is to not, just because unless I had buy-in from every single person in that channel prior, I'm kind of inclined to keep that as it was that course team. And that if there's anything that was really important to capture from those conversations, my inclination is to leave that channel because I can still search it, but to create a channel for every new course team. And I may actually ultimately do what Tristan said and delete things. For now, I think I'll create new until I realize that's not viable over a long period of time. But I try to capture useful information in other documents that can be stored, like Google Docs, that can also be shared with like new generations of course teams. So that's sort of what I'm both thinking and still debating.
Awesome. Thanks for sort of following up with that. So, now's the time. We've got a little bit of time left. I want to open it up for questions that the group may have. If you just want to unmute yourself and ask, if you want to type it in the chat, things you're interested in hearing more about. From Jason, for everyone, do you wish that Slack did anything better for your courses? Ergo, track participant, right? Track participation, track participants. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard one.
Yeah, I mean, I know it does track participation sort of en masse, having maybe better, sort of more resolved data would probably be useful to see who's participating and who's not, especially for large groups. I wish that it supported, so in math you use LaTeX a lot, which is a typesetting program. I wish that it supported LaTeX. I had a TA who was who was good with computers, who wrote a bot that could compile LaTeX on Slack, but it was not super reliable. And so yeah, some more support for sort of scientific typesetting in Slack would be super useful.
It's a really good one, and one that we've definitely heard before, for sure, on a number of fronts with a number of different platforms as well, beyond Slack as well. Really interesting question as well in there. How do you decide whether a course warrants an entire Slack workspace or just a channel? I'll jump in a little bit, and I think a lot of it also depends on this. This really is heavily dependent on the size of the course, because as Tristan pointed out, manually adding 400 students to that workspace was challenging. If you can auto link it with your Canvas roster, okay, that's at least easier, and that's a workspace, right? If you decided to use a channel, you would at that point would probably have to add everyone individually. So I think it just depends on the unique aspects of the course and what you're deciding you want to use with it. Also comes down to functionality, within a channel. If you want to have multiple channels, like Tristan gave that example of, like, there were multiple channels in that workspace for different purposes. That would be a really interesting, you would want to have a workspace for that rather than just a bunch of channels that you have to keep adding everybody to, I think. Did that resonate with folks, or anything I may have missed there?
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, I don't want to monopolize, so somebody should tell me to stop. But for me, I think I wanted to have, to organize the discussion. I think to have places where certain types of discussion were encouraged, and other places where, because otherwise, I think if you are mixing too much the sort of mechanical parts of the class, the scientific parts of the class, and the social parts of the class, then it would just be a bit of a mess. So I think I liked having a workspace with different channels to sort of compartmentalize the various parts of the experience for people. Very
good. Yeah. So Lauren followed up on the question. Thank you, Tristan. Lauren chimed in and asked, has anybody looked at the analytics for engagement stats? Has it been helpful to anyone?
I literally learned about this right now. I'm gonna go look.
We've done our job. We've triggered a new thing that has to be followed. So yeah, and Tristan, am I right that it's mostly compiled, like it's aggregate across users? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, it just tells you how many people interact with Slack in a week or something like that. So if there's 400 people, it'll tell you that. I mean, you can see little charts about engagement, and it'll show, say, any given week, maybe 170 people engaged and 70 posted or something, but it doesn't tell you who. But yeah, that was useful enough to get a sense of whether all the work was really worth it, or whether I was just doing a lot of work for 20 people to chat with each other.
Yeah, and I actually think this is something that circles back to another sort of question. I think for each of you, Monika and Tristan, it's a little bit different because one is with students, one is with sort of the course team. But inevitably, there's got to be ebbs and flows in usage, right? So there are going to be times inevitably where I would suspect, man, everyone is using this all the time. Maybe it's a piece that is due. Maybe it's you're in the middle of grading. And there are other times where there's nothing to be posted. And it's weird because you're like, wait a second, is this thing on? Like, is this working? And so I guess the question coming out of that is like, how do you manage engagement expectations with each of those groups, and sort of also setting your own expectations for when it's okay to have those ebbs and flows, when it's, you're not constantly pushing to have to engage with. I think that may be a concern for some, right? Is like, do I have to constantly be on Slack every second of every day if I'm using it this way?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I did find that I was on Slack a lot, but it actually didn't bother me. I mean, it's easier to engage with Slack on your phone or whatever than it is to write an email or something. So it does, I mean, like Monika was saying, it does encourage sort of less formal interactions, which is lowers the pressure, I think, a little bit. But yeah, I think, and there were certainly ebbs and flows. The night before PSET was due, usership would spike, and over Thanksgiving, nobody used Slack. So, but yeah, I mean, I didn't really have a policy about how much I expected people to use it. So I didn't really worry too much about that, but I think it's a serious concern. Yeah.
Yeah, I can comment from the course team perspective. Most folks, I mean, I'm a strong encourager of boundary setting and making notifications happen if you're compulsive and can't help yourself from checking everything because it's addictive, which I can't turn notifications off because I just can't yet. So I'm always checking my Slack stuff and am absurdly responsive, which I just take as a point of pride. But I think I haven't done anything formal. I think a reasonable expectation is if I Slack someone on my course team and like it takes them over 48 hours to respond, then I shoot them a Slack and an email and say, hey, I get it if you're busy, but like 2 days is a lot. And I expect this to be a good source of real-time communication. Can you tell me what's going on? And sometimes it's just that they're delinquent or they don't have a good setup for Slack communication. They're like signing on to, I don't know, the like browser version, and they don't have something downloaded on their phone or on their computer. And so sometimes it's just a technical formality. And sometimes they've just been ignoring me or haven't sent notifications, in which case they're like, I'm very sorry. I will change my notifications. I go, great. That is very nice. Thank you. But that hasn't been very frequent. And I think, again, from a course team perspective, everyone's pretty dedicated and wants to do a good job. And so very few people are purposely trying to ignore you on Slack in my context.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to be cognizant of time. And so I know there's one more question and we're going to get to it if folks can stick around. But if you've got to jump off, we sort of understand it's that time of day. So thank you to let this be my formal thank you to all of our panelists and people who contributed with questions and ideas and coming and being part of the conversation. If you need to jump off, I understand. I want to, Betsy asked the question of, how might Slack feel from a student's perspective? In other words, how does it feel if all of their courses are using Slack? Does that feel potentially overwhelming maybe? That's a really good question. I wonder, that's a really great question. Does anybody have any thoughts, feedback?
Yeah, I can't comment because I used it exclusively with my course team, so I can't answer that one, but perhaps Tristan.
I mean, I think when I was using it, most of my students did not have any other classes using Slack, so I didn't have to worry about that too much. But yeah, I can imagine from well, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, all the students use Piazza for every class, and they don't seem to worry about that too much. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure how they would feel, but at the time, I mean, they didn't seem to worry about it too much. They seem to like it for the most part, although it's a bit of a self-selecting group, that the people who used it were the ones who liked it. So I can't say for sure.
No, I think it's something to consider. I also think it's, back to what all of the panelists have said, is like also about how you build the community of use around it. Like, what is the purpose of it, right? Like, if you're really setting it up in an authentic way, much like we've heard from the panelists, where it is part of the class, it's sort of integrated and being utilized sort of in these purposeful ways. I feel like that might feel a lot more authentic, and students are, and course teams are much more likely to want to engage at that point than if it sort of feels just like this is something, it's busy work. I'm being forced to post these things, not because we're going to use them or not because we're going to engage with them, but simply so that you can check a box that I engaged, right? Like, I think those have very different feels for students. And so the more authentic you can, the more ways you can foster authentic engagement, the better the sort of outcomes are likely to be. All right, I noticed one more, a couple of things. So, Jason asked the question, do you feel that Slack increased engagement compared to maybe more or other methods? Tristan, I guess that's maybe a question for you. I mean, I know it's sort of, it's not the perfect one-to-one because it happened sort of during remote times, but I think you mentioned that you felt like it had a pretty positive impact, and if you maybe follow that up a little bit.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I haven't tried using Slack during a sort of quasi post-pandemic world, so I can't say. I mean, maybe I'll try. I'm teaching in the same course actually this spring, so maybe I'll try to use it then and see how it goes. But I would say that my experience with teaching this big class in fall 2020 was that without Slack, students would have basically had Piazza. Lectures were totally hopeless as far as students interacting with each other. Even when I tried to make small groups happen during lectures, people would just go into their small group room and sit quietly with their screens off on mute. It wasn't particular. I mean, it's just hard to make engagement happen. And then the way that students would interact with each other is they just talk to their friends that they had in the class, or to friends they had who had taken the class previously or whatever. So it was very, there was almost no interaction between students outside of Slack. And I think Slack was very useful in getting students to talk to each other who maybe wouldn't otherwise have talked to each other. So I think it was, versus doing nothing in the remote setting, I think it was very positive. Whether or not in a situation where there is in-person classes, whether it will have any impact, it's hard to say. I'm not sure.
And I think it's a little unfortunate that Stefan had to step out to go teach, because I think his experience this term sort of reflects a little bit of that move towards utilizing it to bring people back into the classroom. Like the way he's sort of set that up to be the pre-class activity that leverages and is the entry point into the communication in the classroom. really seems to strengthen that relationship, so that, oh, if I know if he's calling out and referencing people in there, and I've got really specific questions that maybe if I post that, it's going to get addressed, or I'm going to get to engage with other people who have different ideas. You know, it starts to, again, foster that real authentic engagement, more so than sort of just, I have to post because that's what the syllabus says. We are unfortunately at time. I know it went by quickly, and it was a great conversation, and I hope everyone found it valuable. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. So again, a huge thank you to our panelists for volunteering to share their stories of using Slack. And you know, if you've got more questions or comments or ideas, or want to share more of your own stories, please reach out to anybody in our office, whether that be Molly, myself, Lauren, Cheryl Barnes, who was on the call and then had to run, our director. We look forward to hearing more from sort of everybody along the way. So thank you, everybody, and best of luck as we wrap up the term and head to the holiday break. Bye, everyone.